Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. My name is Jacques Berlinerblau, and I am the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization at the Wall School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to the second annual Andrew H. Siegal Memorial Lectureship in American Middle Eastern Foreign Policy. On behalf of our Associate Director, Dr. Anna Sommer-Schneider, and the Assistant Director, Ira Foreman, we thank you all for being here today. Before we get to the actual intellectual content of the day, you might notice you all have a brochure on your seats. If you open them up, you will receive some timely and priceless information about our next event, which is the Stoltz Family Biennial Conference on Contemporary Anti-Semitism, a subject which is grimly part of our news cycle this week and many other weeks as well. Please notice it is a full-day conference next Wednesday, November 7th, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in Riggs Library. As with every event in the Center for Jewish Civilization, it is open and free to the public, and if you look at the roster of speakers, I hope you'll agree that we have brought to the hilltop some of the leading experts on the vexed subject of European anti-Semitism. We'll be doing domestic anti-Semitism in April, on April 10th, at an event you'll be hearing about more, which will take place at the National Press Club. Which brings us to our featured event today. The person who conceptualized this lecture and thought about it and approached me and thought that this would be a great idea to endow this and have this subject addressed in perpetuity is Mr. Michel Deutsch. Mr. Deutsch graduated from the college with a degree in history and continued on to receive his JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. He is a founding partner at the law firm of Singer Deutsch, LLP. It's a securities and employment firm, and he founded the firm with another Georgetown Law Center alum, John D. Singer, class of '92. In February 2017, Mr. Deutsch established the Andrew H. Siegal Memorial Professorship. It includes this wonderful lecture, and it also makes it possible for the lecturer that you will hear today to be able to lecture our students in the Center for Jewish Civilization. So to tell you a little bit about the person whose memory we enshrine, please join me in welcoming Mr. Michel Deutsch.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and appreciate your attendance here today. Andy Siegal, who was a good friend of mine, was a philanthropist during his lifetime, and he wanted to ensure continued support for institutions which were near and dear to his heart after his death. Andy believed in a variety of Jewish causes and supported them with a particular focus on educational institutions. Andy lived both in the United States and in Israel, and Israel was near and dear to his heart, and he believed in its place in the world and looked forward to a day when Israel would live in peace with its neighbors. The Andrew H. Siegal Foundation believes in the mission of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University, fully supports it here, and to that end established the professorship that Jacques just mentioned, as well as this lecture series. The idea is to support engagement and dialogue about Israel, its place in the Middle East, its place in the world, about the peace process, and about American engagement with the players in the region and the fundamental issues that will face the United States and its leaders in the near future and in the long term. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to take a small part in this introduction of the newest professor to hold this position, Tamara Cofman Wittes. She follows Elliot Abrams, who first held this post last year. Our new professor has fantastic credentials, a wealth of experience, is open to engagement and dialogue, and has long-standing ties to the Georgetown community. And I know that Jacques can give a far more eloquent and detailed biography of her, but I did want to give her a warm welcome to the post and look forward to hearing everything she has to say here today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. And now to the feature attraction. Our distinguished speaker today is Tamara Cofman Wittes. Dr. Wittes is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, and she is, as you now know, the Andrew H. Siegal Professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization. She served as Deputy Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November 2009 to January 2012. Her job was coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East, in the Middle East Partnership Initiative, She also served as Deputy Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions. Like all of our professors, Wittes is a prolific author. She's the author of Freedom's Unsteady March, America's Role in Building Arab Democracy, and she is the editor of How Israelis and Palestinians Negotiate, a cross-cultural analysis of the Oslo peace process. She holds a bachelor's in Judaic and Near Eastern Studies from Oberlin College and a master's and a doctorate in government from Georgetown University. Dr. Wittes serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute, as well as the advisory board of the Israel Institute, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Women in International Security. In addition to those impeccable scholarly credentials, she teaches for us in the center this semester, and you see her students sprinkled around the room. She's teaching U.S. alliances and Middle Eastern foreign policy. She's very excited about the paper she's going to present because it's a new one, it's all fresh, and I can't wait to hear it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible welcome. And Mr. Deutsch, thank you so much for the honor that I have this year being back at the Hilltop. It is really a joy to be back at Georgetown. I spent 7 years here as a graduate student. I taught for a few more years in the Security Studies program after that. And I'm very, very grateful to Jacques for recruiting me to come on back after 10 years away and teach the very talented students that I have in my CJC course. I'm really enjoying it. So thank you for making it possible. Tonight's subject is Israel in democratic decline. It's a challenging one to discuss. And I think this is a particularly difficult moment in which to discuss it. Those of us whose lives and careers are intertwined with Israel celebrate and embrace the shared democratic values, the openness, the pluralism, the welcoming of immigrants and refugees. These are things that traditionally structure politics here in the United States and politics in Israel. And indeed, polls show us that most Americans see shared values as a central foundation for the strong relationship between our governments and beyond. And yet this is a day on which many of us are questioning our society, questioning our values. We are thinking of the horrific week that has just passed. And we are looking ahead to the election day that is exactly a week away from today, and we're wondering whether the civic creed at the heart of our own democracy is now torn, maybe beyond repair, by the coarsening of our public discourse, by the rise in expressions of bigotry, by 3 violent men driven by hatred whose horrible acts in the past week killed 13 people and might have killed many more. So we're worried about our own democracy right here and now. Who are we at this moment to be talking about the democratic health of another society? I would argue that actually it's precisely here and now that we must raise the question of how we understand a healthy democracy in an age of populism, whether here in Israel or in other democracies around the world. We need to confront the challenges we face. We need to understand them, see them for what they are. The events of this past week are not merely sporadic, irrational bursts of violence. They occur within a context of political trends with wider implications. And so we have to understand those trends and what they mean. Understanding what makes our democracies vulnerable to decay and decline is the first step to renewing and strengthening them. And so we will forge ahead. Now, in Israel, I think the rise of this ethno-nationalist politics, this populist discourse, alongside some specific laws and a number of legislative proposals that affect civil liberties and democratic institutions, these things have triggered concerns that the country might be falling prey to the same kind of intolerant illiberalism that we see in countries like Turkey, Hungary, the Philippines, Poland. For some people, this is a trend that's personified in the figure of Benjamin Netanyahu. He certainly has deployed some exclusionary, racially tinged political rhetoric in recent years, and he's built a close partnership with some illiberal governments like Hungary. But he's hardly the only manifestation of this trend. What I will try to do in my remarks this afternoon is examine the elements of Israeli politics that have generated these questions about Israel's democratic future. I'll evaluate them in light of what we understand about populism and its relationship to democratic decline. Is that always a direct connection? How does it connect? I'll assess on that basis whether I think Israel is in fact experiencing a decline in its democratic character. And I'll hypothesize a little bit about what developments might affect the future of Israel's democratic trajectory. But I'm not going to keep you in suspense about my views on the question that is the title of my talk today. I see some indicators of real concern in Israel's politics today, but I also see sources of resilience in Israeli politics, sources that can help the society protect its democratic fundamentals from erosion by these exclusionary populist appeals. Some of those sources of resilience are institutional in the structure of Israel's party system and its government. Some of those sources are deeper, rooted in Israel's diverse and dynamic society. And so to preserve and strengthen Israeli democracy, I see it as absolutely crucial to protect Israel's civil society. But let's begin by understanding the nature of the liberal democracy that we and Israel share, along with many other countries. Now, today, Israel held municipal elections for mayors and city councils all over the country. And next week, voters across the US will be electing county commissioners and local judges and congressmen and senators and governors. And these voting exercises, that casting of the ballot, is at the heart of any democratic system. We celebrate these things. Jacques mentioned I'm on the board of the National Democratic Institute. One of our happiest functions is to observe voting in elections in countries around the world. But we know that democracy doesn't rest only on formal procedures like voting. The act of voting itself represents something deeper. It represents free choice. So what makes a voter's choice free? A few things. Rights, civil liberties, things like freedom of speech, freedom of association. Those let you debate the issues and make a free choice. An open, competitive political system with alternation of power, protection for unpopular views or for minority constituencies. And voting also rests on the idea of equality, that your vote weighs the same as mine. My opinion, my words, my needs have equal weight to yours in the law, in the political system. And no one is privileged over anyone else. So these substantive values, civil liberties, minority protections, legal equality, these are part and parcel of liberal democracy. They're what prevent a democratic society from becoming a majoritarian mob. And when you look at some of the countries whose democracy seems to have gone off the rails, you can see that that connection very clearly. When Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey began to transform his rule, he first went after the media, and then he went after the judiciary. These are two key institutional constraints on majoritarian rule. These are two protectors of those liberal values, especially civil liberties. So majoritarianism without free expression, without political competition, without legal equality is not a recipe for democracy that lasts. It's a recipe for a party or a political leader to get into power and then ensure that no one can ever get them out of power. Now, scholars of populism, political theorists like Jan Werner Müller at Princeton or my brilliant colleague Bill Galston at Brookings, make a distinction between two types of populist politics. They talk about thin populism and thick populism. Thin populism is the kind where a political entrepreneur or a political leader campaigns to represent the marginalized, the little people, against corrupt elites. And thick populism is when a political entrepreneur works to define and enforce a certain view of who is a legitimate part of the political community. And who is that community, what the will of that community is, a thick populist will claim that only they can understand. And so in the United States, in many European countries, you'll see that thin style of political populism evident in a kind of class-based set of arguments about the little guy and the corrupt elites, about Main Street versus Wall Street, for example. And the thick or exclusionary variety tends to be more defining the nation, often in ethnic terms. And it's that thick variety of populism that we political scientists worry about when we worry about the health of democracy. And why is that? Because by its nature, it's exclusionary. Jan Werner Müller defines exclusionary populism as a particular moralistic imagination of politics. He says a way of perceiving the political world that sets a morally pure, unified, but ultimately fictional people against elites who are deemed corrupt or in some other way morally inferior. And here's the exclusionary part. In addition to being anti-elitist, exclusionary populists are always anti-pluralist. Populists who claim that they and only they represent the people, understand the will of the people, and can manifest the will of the people. And what's exclusionary about that, what's anti-pluralist about that, is that anyone, therefore, who's speaking up in disagreement with that kind of leader must not really be part of the community, because the leader naturally understands what the community wants. So anyone speaking up in disagreement must be an outsider, or maybe sent by an outsider, or prompted by an outsider, paid by an outsider, controlled by an outsider. Maybe they're a traitor, but certainly they don't belong, and we shouldn't leave space for them. And given this understanding, you can see how this kind of exclusionary populism, this thick populism, is fundamentally opposed to the core assumption of liberalism. The core assumption of liberalism is that the public is full of lots of different kinds of people with lots of different interests and lots of different preferences. No one has a monopoly on truth, and so we have to set things up so that every person has the chance to freely choose for themselves how they want to run their life. And this exclusionary populism, by contrast, posits this unitary will of the people that's understood perfectly and naturally by the populist leader and that should not be resisted. Or, as then candidate Trump said at a campaign event in May 2016, quote, "The only important thing is the unification of the people because the other people don't mean anything." So this kind of exclusionary politics is a form of identity politics. The populist leader decides who's in and who's out, who has legitimacy to speak and participate, and who gets excluded. If you were thinking about it in terms of the identity politics on campus, you talk about who has standing to speak, who has legitimacy to speak. And you see this translated in exclusionary populism today. So is there populism of this kind in Israeli politics? Yeah, there's a lot of it. Israeli politics actually evidences both the thin kind of populism and the thick kind of populism. Although the left-right distinction that we see in Europe and the US doesn't hold quite so well in Israel. In Israel, you'll see thin populism coming from folks like Yair Lapid, who talks a lot about corrupt elites versus the little guy. Aryeh Deri's Sephardic Torah Party, same kind of thin class-based populism. Despite its fervent ultra-Orthodox belief system, the Shas party tries to appeal to less observant Mizrahi voters on the basis that Shas can help them overcome their marginalization at the hands of political elites. Class-based thin populism also exists on the left in Israeli politics, in the communist Hadash party, but as yet, that party is largely perceived by most Israelis as an Arab party rather than a communist party. And on the right side of the Israeli political spectrum, we now see not just emergent, but actually holding the preponderant power in the current Israeli government coalition, several varieties of that thick kind of populism. Within the Likud, the ruling party, Netanyahu, his allies like Miri Regev or Zev Elkin, often use exclusionary rhetoric, not only against the Arab minority, but also against leftists who disagree with them on policy toward the Palestinians or toward that Arab minority. If you look at media interviews or the Facebook pages on which most of Israeli politics is played out on Facebook these days, if you look at the Facebook pages of cabinet ministers in the current government, you'll find plenty of statements in which they're calling their critics or their political opponents on the left traitors to Israel, suggesting that they're tools of outside forces like the European Union or George Soros. Netanyahu blamed the New Israel Fund, for example, for interfering in Israeli diplomacy and scuttling a deal with Rwanda to accept deported African asylum seekers. He said the goal of the New Israel Fund was to erase Israel's Jewish character. And you see some similar themes from Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked in the Jewish Home Party. Ideas also about what this natural polity, what this natural political community is. That the natural people of Israel are the Jewish people. The most authentic manifestation of the Jewish people are traditionally observant people who embrace the greater land of Israel as an indivisible birthright that must be preserved under Israeli sovereignty. And so those are two varieties of Jewish populism in Israel. There's a third, evident in Avigdor Lieberman's Israel is Our Home, Yisrael Beitenu party. Lieberman's party appeals to immigrants from the former Soviet Union and their descendants. It's avowedly secular in its orientation rather than religious. And many of these immigrants from the former Soviet countries are not considered Jewish under the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate. And so Lieberman's thick populism is of a more ethnic variety, much closer to the kind of populism that we see among European parties on the right. And those European parties focus on immigration. Lieberman in 2009 ran on a platform demanding that Arabs in Israel should take a loyalty oath to the Jewish state as a condition for maintaining their citizenship. And he continues to propose this idea of a territorial swap in which the heavily Arab populated areas of Israel in the Galilee would be transferred to the Palestinians along with their Arab population in order to reduce the proportion of Arabs within the Israeli body politic. And as I've been observing the municipal council campaign that's been going on for the last month or so, I think we've seen both the Likud party and the Jewish Home Party appealing to some pretty explicit fear-mongering and racial politics in their advertisements. In Tel Aviv, the Likud campaign, and let's start from the understanding that Likud is probably not going to win a lot of seats on the Tel Aviv City Council. So I don't think this was a bid for the center among the Tel Aviv electorate, but they posted ads on bus stops headlined, "It's us or them," counterposing an Israeli flag labeled "the Hebrew City," with a photo of demonstrating Eritrean asylum seekers labeled "the infiltrators." They had another ad that counterposed that photo of the Israeli flag labeled "the Hebrew City" with a photo of a masked Palestinian demonstrator that was labeled "the Islamic Movement in Yafo." In Ramla, which is a mixed Jewish-Arab city, the Jewish Home Party posted ads showing a young woman wearing a Muslim headscarf turning away from a Shabbat table with wine and candles with the following message: "There have been a number of instances of conversion in Ramla, and no one cares. Tomorrow, it could be your daughter. Only a strong Jewish home can protect a Jewish Ramla." So how do we understand this kind of politics? Does it present a threat to Israeli democracy? Or is it a style, maybe an unattractive style, but an effective style of political competition and nothing more? Does this kind of discourse have a deleterious effect on the democratic system or on the liberal protections that sustain that system? I think one way to assess the danger is to look at how exclusionary politics might get translated into actual exclusion in political institutions. How might populists prevent others from winning elections or from seeing their rights, their equality manifest in the political system? And as you'll see over the next few minutes, I don't yet see too much of that going on in the Israeli political system. I think for many observers, the most troubling manifestation of Israel's current populist politics is the nation-state law that was passed a few months ago. It was debated for 7 years. It was rewritten multiple times and never brought to a final vote until this year. And now that it's been passed, what does it say? Well, it asserts that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. In other words, Israel is a Jewish state. It also declares that Hebrew is the only official language of the state of Israel, eliminating Arabic, which had been an official language alongside Hebrew, and saying that Arabic maintains a special status that will be determined by law. It embraces Jewish settlement as a national value, and that's led some to question whether the state will now encourage discrimination in housing in towns and cities. Now, for the 20% of Israel's citizens who are Arab, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Druze, or of other faiths, this law was widely perceived as declaring them second-class citizens. Second-class citizens in their own homeland where their families had lived for generations before the establishment of Israel. So that was one group that felt concretely excluded by this law. And for many other Israelis, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who wanted their government to move toward a more secular vision of the state, the lack of a clear statement in the nation-state law about equality, about legal equality, was seen as a blow. A blow not just to ethnic or religious minorities, but to those who don't embrace the dictates of Orthodox Judaism as defined by the chief rabbinate. If equality under the law had been enshrined in this basic law or in another basic law, it might allow, for example, a Jew to marry a non-Jew or to marry someone who's not recognized as halakhically Jewish by the Orthodox rabbinate. Interestingly, the debate that erupted around the passage of the law and after its passage, and the way that debate was understood in Israeli politics, didn't really go to those questions of what kind of state do we want. Instead, the debate over the law, the protests that followed its passage, make manifest a challenge that we face in trying to assess Israel's democratic health. It's the difficulty in disentangling populism and identity politics from Israel's conflict with the Palestinians. It's an analytical challenge, and it's a real challenge for Israeli society. In Israel, if you poll on any question of politics or policy, the responses that you get will be highly correlated with views of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can look at someone's demographic characteristics, whether they live in a small town or a city, whether they have a college degree or not, what their income level is, and you can predict with pretty good accuracy what their views will be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what their views will be on a variety of other policy issues. It is a society that, if you look at the public opinion data, is just split on this one issue that colors everything else about the way people see each other. And I'll just tell you one story. As I was researching this topic over the summer, and I was in Israel meeting with a colleague, a fellow political scientist, and she was trying to explain to me the degree of correlation in the polls, the extent of polarization in Israeli society. And she told me about a day that for some volunteer activity she was engaging in, she needed to get a green t-shirt because everyone on her team were going to wear green t-shirts. So she went into a t-shirt shop and she asked the woman who was clerking there, do you have any green t-shirts? And my colleague is a middle-aged Israeli professor from Tel Aviv. She dresses fashionably, she's got short hair and it's highlighted, and so she asked this clerk, do you have any green t-shirts? And the clerk sort of looked through the racks and said, well, we don't have any that are salad green. I have this one that's a camo shirt. It's got a military camouflage pattern, sort of olive green. And my friend said, well, that's not really what I need. And the clerk got very offended. And she said to her, what's wrong with you? I mean, I served in the army too. In other words, this clerk, the minute that my friend walked into the store, saw the way she was dressed, the way she spoke, and made a set of assumptions about her political views, including that she must have hostility to the military and therefore would reject a camouflage t-shirt. And this is just an illustration of how split Israeli society is on questions of their existential identity conflict with the Palestinians. It is hard for Israelis, whether they're Arab citizens of Israel or Jewish citizens of Israel, to see their differences with one another not through the lens of their conflict. And so Jewish fans of the nation-state law see granting equality under the law as a step toward the erasure of Jewish sovereignty. And Arab opponents of the law see gaining equality, if it had been included in the nation-state law, as a victory in one of two ways, I think, within the Arab community. For some, it's a way of moving toward a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through creating a democracy for all its citizens. And for others, it's a way of ensuring that if there is a two-state solution eventually, Palestinian citizens of Israel will be able to maintain their status within Israel and not be subject to a Lieberman-style transfer. So this conflation, this overlay of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on every issue in Israeli politics makes it very, very hard to disentangle whether the identity politics that we see is an identity politics that's okay, compatible with democracy, or whether it's something that undermines democracy. Certainly, the nation-state law undermines the symbolism of equality for non-Jews in Israel. Certainly, it could make it harder for Arab citizens of Israel to be heard by a government that no longer is required to accept documents, testimony in Arabic on an equal level with such documents and testimony in Hebrew. As an expression of intent of the political parties who passed this law in the Knesset, the nation-state law could be seen as troubling, particularly in its failure to make equality under the law a basic principle. And then we have this question about whether that exclusion and the mention of Jewish settlement is going to lead to discrimination. The creation of, there are already Jewish-only settlements and Jewish-only towns through the Jewish Agency, but whether the Israeli government is now going to accept and embrace that same framework in treating the municipalities and localities under the national government. So we have extreme political language that's exclusionary and troubling. We have a nation-state law that, as an indicator of where these populist parties are going, seems troubling. So why am I not yet worried about the ability of populist political forces in Israel to overtake the state's democratic institutions in ways that would permanently undermine democratic politics? And the argument that you hear is that, look, Israeli politics is moving to the right. Netanyahu's current government is the most right-wing government in Israeli history, and it's lasted for almost its entire term, which will be a record, I think, at least in the last several decades for Israeli governments. And the reason I'm not yet worried is because I see two fundamental sources of resilience inside Israel, and I want to just describe each of them to you briefly. The first is the fragmentation of Israel's political system. Now, generally speaking, we wouldn't consider that a good thing, because it makes getting things done in politics a lot harder. But one interesting feature of populist politics in Israel, of these exclusionary populists in Israel, one interesting feature is how competitive they are with one another. Rather than, as we've seen in other democracies like Hungary or Turkey, where you have a single populist movement, usually on the right, that just zooms in and sort of sucks up all the oxygen. Israel's fragmented parliamentary democracy has produced these multiple competing populist movements with competing leaders. Israel's system combines this pure proportional representation system for the parliament with a relatively low threshold of entry into the parliament, 3.25%. They've raised it a couple of times in the last decade, but it's still relatively low. And what we've seen over time is that many of Israel's smaller parties are, in essence, not trying to make a play for the political center or for a majority, but they're representing specific constituencies, specific interest groups within Israeli society. We see that with the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox parties. We see it with Lieberman's Russian immigrant-based party, just to give a couple of examples. They're essentially interest group rent-seeking parties rather than political parties aiming for majority. That hasn't changed. What's changed is the proportion of the Israeli Knesset that's held by the big parties, the ones that are playing for the political center, the ones that do want to be the leaders of the majority. It's dwindled. From 1949 through about 1992, the parties that today we call Labor and Likud, but that have been through different manifestations, they dominated the Knesset. They controlled up to 2/3 of the seats. And in the 2015 elections, the last Knesset elections, 30 seats for Likud was considered an overwhelming victory. That's 25% of the parliament. Now, populism of this exclusionary variety and competition don't live very easily together. Populist parties, if they're going to represent the organic will of the whole people, if you claim to represent that, then you really can't allow for competition for that role. In fact, the very fact that there's competition suggests that you might not actually represent the people as you claim to. So competition amongst populist parties actually undermines the logic of populism overall. Competition between populist leaders also makes it much, much harder for populist parties to translate majority place in electoral politics into a dominance over the political system. What we've seen in countries where populist politics really has led to democratic decline, countries like Hungary or Turkey, is we've seen a unitary political apparatus under a single leader who represents that natural will of the people. And then they try to establish a monopoly over the state apparatus in order to reward their supporters, punish their opponents, and set up political rules so that they will dominate in future competition. It's actually hard to do that when the populist government is a team of rivals with different sets of supporters. And that's what we actually have in today's Israeli government. And I think in many ways that dynamic, that team of rivals problem for Israeli populists is especially tough right now and getting tougher. Because the current prime minister is facing a possible criminal indictment on corruption charges. And there are others both inside the Likud party and outside it who are trying to position themselves to replace him if and when he leaves politics. So that competition is getting fiercer. The stakes are getting higher. And these guys are less and less willing to subsume their own profile and preferences to those of the man who's now on top. So because the party system is fragmented, because many of the smaller parties are special interest parties, the prospects for that kind of dominant populist coalition with a shared vision is constrained. And Netanyahu's current coalition agrees on one thing, really, which is Jewish settlement in the occupied territories. But on every other major policy issue, it's fractured. And this brings me to the other source of resilience that I see in Israeli politics today, and that's the possibility for new kinds of political coalitions. I described to you these overlapping cleavages, the way Israeli society and Israeli politics is so polarized by the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's disturbing in terms of social cohesion. It has other implications. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is what defines left and right in Israel. It divides Israelis, but it also serves in a perverse way to bind Israeli Jews together because they have this shared sense of existential threat. And it's that sense of threat that is wielded by populist politicians as they build their appeals rooted in exclusion. So the longer this conflict goes unresolved, the more of material that those exclusionary populists have to work with in the Jewish part of Israeli society. But the deeper problem is that this polarization around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is having an insidious effect on the domestic policy space as well. Put simply, because Israeli politicians know that they can base their appeals to the left, to the right, to whomever, around attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they have less and less incentive to respond to the clear needs and priorities of Israeli voters on any other issue. It's cheaper, it's easier to mobilize on the basis of emotional appeals that are divisive and rooted in fear. We've seen that here as well. And this can come back to bite Israeli politicians when unresolved issues within Israeli society get ridden roughshod over by politicians playing identity politics. I see there are two distinct categories, two distinct sets of issues, let me say, within Israeli society that cut across this left-right divide over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and that cut across all these political parties. They even cut across religious and secular in Israeli society. And those two issues are issues related to the status of women and issues related to the LGBT community. Across Israeli sectors, Arab sector, the Haredi sector, the national religious sector, the secular sector, you see more women getting more educated, getting more engaged in the workforce, and achieving at higher levels. You see this especially most dramatically in the Arab sector and in the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox sector. And it's driven for them by economic reality, that the state welfare system is providing less. Those populations within Israeli society are growing as a share of the society, and women as well as men are needed to be earners. And in the Haredi community, women are the only earners because men, if they are able, spend their lives in Torah study rather than working. So over the past few years, we've seen women across the divides in Israeli society pushing forward for greater inclusion, greater social inclusion, greater economic inclusion, and greater political inclusion. There's been a push for civil marriage, a push to use secular courts to overcome the bias against women that exists in the religious court system that handles divorce, child custody, things like that. We've seen ultra-Orthodox women suing in the courts for the right to be candidates in ultra-Orthodox party lists. They didn't succeed in the last go-round, but they will be trying again next year. So across the divisions in Israeli society, you have women seeking to see their interests better manifested in politics and policy. And there's a lot of possibility there for coalition building, right? I think you see the same thing with the LGBT community. Look, LGBT people exist across social sectors, right? They exist in every family. And what we saw in Israel this year was one very interesting example of that. When the Israeli Knesset passed a law setting conditions for surrogacy, for childbirth, and excluded gay couples from the ability to get state benefits to have a surrogate carry their child. And we saw a massive protest spring up in the wake of this passage of this law, a protest that was so broad. It was joined by LGBT groups that represented, I think, every sector of Israeli society, varieties of religious LGBT groups, secular LGBT groups, Arab LGBT groups. And the protest was so broad and so fierce that a whole lot of major companies operating in Israel quickly announced their support for the protest and that they would provide surrogacy benefits to their employees to compensate for the exclusion in the law. So what do these things suggest to me? They suggest that there's a possibility for politics across divides, and politics across divides that in particular will push back against one of the features of Israeli politics that have made it so stuck, which is the lock that the Orthodox rabbinate, both Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, have over policy, especially social policy. Now, there are within the Israeli political system people who are trying to build these kinds of coalitions, but they're not in the parties. Because as I said, the parties just don't have an incentive to mobilize that way, because they can get their voters, whom they've already identified, with emotional appeals on the conflict. So who's doing this? Civil society organizations. I'll give you one very small example. The Ethiopian Israeli community, relative newcomers to Israeli society, but have been there for a couple of generations, have recently been struggling with real issues of police violence. And they feel that, that the police have been discriminating against their community, have been too quick to use coercion when dealing with Ethiopians on the street, and that their community has been conflated with the African asylum seekers toward whom the state has a very tough stance. The other community in Israel that is struggling right now with a major issue related to police violence is the Arab community, where there was a major demonstration in Haifa earlier this year that was broken up violently by the police, resulted in breaking the leg of a major Arab politician, and created great controversy. And believe it or not, these two communities are starting to work across some very difficult identity politics to address the issue of police violence. So if the parties aren't doing it, that leaves coalition building to the grassroots. Grassroots sees the potential. Grassroots is starting to act. And one day, I suspect that Israeli party activists will see this potential and pick up these platforms and carry them forward. And so, as has been true in many democracies over many times and places, it seems to me that Israel's civil society is the one that is creating dynamism and new possibility in Israeli politics today. And it's Israel's civil society that can carry forward Israeli democracy, even in the face of exclusionary populism. And so let me close with this final thought, which is that of all the manifestations of exclusionary populism that I have seen in Israel over the last few years, the one that concerns me most is the demonization of civil society. Because if only certain expressions in society are legitimate, then you're choking off a source of dynamism, a source of solutions for people in politics. And so my hope is that Israeli politicians will see Israeli civil society as a source of power and potential rather than as an adversary. With that, let me close, and I look forward to your questions.
So we're going to have to move a little faster than usual because
I'm sorry.
Coming in a little bit. So let's take a couple of quick questions. No manifestos, just questions. Microphone is coming about. And there we go.
Hi, my name is Aviva Meyer, and I'm involved in civil society in Israel, both through the New Israel Fund and through Americans for Peace Now. The last thing you said was very intriguing because maybe it's just my lack of knowledge, but if you're dependent on civil society and the groups in civil society are all progressive, what about the other side?
Thank you. Well, look, I don't think they are all progressive. I think the current government has shown a spotlight on civil society groups of the left that have left views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on the place of Arabs in Israeli society. And that's part of their broader identity politics game. But there are progressive Israeli civil society organizations that are not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that are more focused on socioeconomic inequality, And there are a lot of civil society organizations that work in what we would call the right, by which we mostly mean the religious communities of Israel, on issues like child poverty and economic inequality and higher education for women. And there is a lot of opportunity for small organizations working in their own communities to join together across boundaries.
More questions? This gentleman over here, the microphone is coming around.
Thank you. I'm Ilan. I'm a student here at Georgetown. And my question is, due to the recent tragedy in Pittsburgh, there's been greater calls for the Israeli government to recognize conservative reform Judaism, but the Israeli chief rabbinate has a very strong views about that. The Orthodox population is growing. They have a stranglehold basically on whoever wants to create a government in Israel. So how do you see that situation? Do you think that the Reform and Conservative are closer to being recognized now than they used to be before? Or is it the situation moving in the other direction? Thank you.
You know, I think the political debate on this in Israel is so often defined as an issue between Israel and diaspora Jews, or Israel and American Jews in particular. And who is left out of that are Jews inside Israel who affiliate with Reform or conservative synagogues. And there's a growing number of them, but they are still very small. And they don't vote on that basis. They organize a little bit on that basis. So to the extent that that trend continues, that more Israelis find traditional but non-Orthodox forms of Jewish expression that they want to see in their society, that's going to make a difference. I think there's one other thing that's going to make a difference, which is what's happening to Shas. You know, for years, Shas, the Sephardic Torah Judaism party, was the political vehicle for Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Middle Eastern descent. And its appeal was, and these are people who in previous generations often grew up Orthodox, but might not be Orthodox themselves. They might have Shabbat dinner, but then they would go out to disco or have Shabbat dinner and then turn on the TV and watch the news. Mizrahim have an incredible legacy of discrimination and marginalization in Israeli society. But the last generation has seen a lot of progress. And one thing that the current government has done is brought more Mizrahim into the judiciary, brought more Mizrahi curriculum into the schools. We've seen more Mizrahi succeed in the private sector, in high tech and things like that. And they've started debates about whether Mizrahim are being excluded from high status jobs in the military. So I think that Shas is losing its flavor as a Mizrahi vehicle. And you're going to see Mizrahim voting in a more diverse way. And that is also going to have an effect on the role of the ultra-Orthodox.
All right, let's take one more question. And this gentleman over here.
Right there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm a visiting student from UC Davis. My question is, what stake do you believe the United States, if any, in the maintenance of its foreign policy has in seeing Israel maintain a vibrant, healthy democracy?
Excellent question, and one that I tackled when I was in government as well as a scholar. I said at the outset of my remarks that we see in American public opinion that Americans see our shared democratic values as an important foundation of the Israeli-American relationship, and that's true. It's very consistent. It's across political parties in American society. Israel is seen by 3/4 of Americans, Democrat, Republican, Independent, as a strategic asset. And the desire to support Israel in its conflict with the Palestinians is also rooted in shared values. So it's very important, if you want to maintain that strong US-Israel relationship at the bilateral government-to-government level, that you have the support of the American people, and the support of the American people is rooted in part in shared values. So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, is that for the United States, all around the world, our best partners are our democratic partners. Whether it's Israel or the UK or Australia or Canada, you know, And as political scientists, we would say not only do democracies not go to war with one another, but when democracies make agreements with other democracies, there's much more credibility and strength in those agreements because we can see into one another's societies. We can help one another resolve democratic politics to support our relationship. So when we have a strong partnership with a democracy that starts to weaken, it challenges our ability to work together. And when I was in the State Department, and there were a couple of proposals in the Israeli Knesset that were designed to either outlaw, penalize, or restrict Israeli civil society groups that got funding from abroad. We worked hard to talk to the Israeli government about why we thought those laws were a bad idea and why freedom of association, which is a right we both hold dear, which is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, demanded that they not impose those kinds of constraints on civil society. And that was something that they came around on. And the law they ultimately passed is more of a transparency law, which is perfectly fair. So I think that not only is it important, but I think we've shown that when we have good relationships, we can have that kind of impact.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank again Mr. Deutsch for making the Andrew and Siegal lecture possible. I want to thank our speaker, Tamara Cofman Wittes. You will see her up on our website, and we're going to do a quick podcast afterwards about her remarks. Thank you to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next week, November 7th. Professor Wittes, thank you so much.